to today. Thank you. So we'll start with a very brief introduction to the summary of the last couple of days and introduction to today's meeting while we wait for someone else to join us. So in the last couple of days, we have seen how to use the INVEST coastal vulnerability model, specifically among the suite of models that INVEST provides, to calculate exposure index. And through the input of population data, we have seen also how the models can represent vulnerability. So in doing that, we have started with a review of the conceptual framework of the model and the way the models define vulnerability, exposure, and risk. We will go a bit deeper into those concepts this morning in the first half of this afternoon, with Miguel Trillo from OIKO, who we will deliver a presentation on the climate risk in coastal scenarios in a broad, more general terms. So definition of the different conceptual framework to define risk, exposure, vulnerability, etc. And we will see how the INVEST definition will fit into those broader definition and consideration. In the second half of this afternoon, we will work with Jonathan McHugh, Yolanda Lin, and Steve Kemp. We introduce the members of the team in the first day, but they will introduce themselves again before they start their presentation. And what we will do, we will try to explore how to actually use a tool like INVEST and the scenarios that can be generated with a tool like INVEST, but also other tools that are out there. We've described in the last couple of days how INVEST has other models. We've also touched upon the general potential application of GIS technologies in the definition of scenarios. And now we really want to discuss how does that enter your workflow to make decision when it comes to land use planning for coastal regions, when it comes to integrated coastal zone management, when it comes to risk management, when it comes to environmental assessment. So we have people from different realms and different expertise, people with different expertise from different governmental departments, community-based organization, NGOs, as well as some researcher. So I hope it will be a very interesting and lively conversation. We'll finish with a brief discussion of potential further researches that uses INVEST or that built upon INVEST and built upon generally coastal scenarios and all the information that you have learned today in the last 3 days. And that is mostly because we know there are some master and PhD students among the participants, and it's good to create this bridge between practitioner, public officers, and the academia work. And we're really glad that UWI is hosting this event because they managed to bring along some of their students, and that I think will make a good opportunity to create those linkages and to have those discussions. Okay. So we will not do a practical exercise today. It's more of a theoretical one. So we will not be using QGIS or INVEST for today. And at the end of the process, I like you to stay a bit longer, or at least to complete a short questionnaire on the training itself that we will send to you through the chat and through email as well. That will help us gather your feedbacks and your thoughts about the training for us to improve later on. We need to obviously get those information for our final report, etc. So we're really keen to hear what you have to say about this whole process, how we can improve, what you liked, what you didn't like, and etc. to make it even more compelling and useful in the future. You will get a certificate of participation for this training. So be sure to complete the online attendance form, which is circulated in the last couple of days. That's give us information that you have been participating, and therefore you will be able to receive the certificate, which will be issued by UWIMONA as part of this project. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, which is Miguel Trillo. Welcome, Miguel.
Hi, thank you, Simone. Hi everyone.
So Miguel will just give a brief introduction of himself, and then we will continue with the presentation. So I'll leave it to you, Miguel. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I share my screen now then? Thank you. Let me try. Let me first introduce myself, and then I will share the screen. Let me see if this works. Desktop, just one second. No. Can you see the screen?
No, we're still seeing you. Well, Miguel, I've figured this out. I'd just like to respond to something that popped in the chat. So as part of this project, this is the last day of training, so there won't be any further training on Invest in QGIS. You will obviously get all the recordings of these videos, so you can go through the material again. You will get the presentation slide, and as I promised yesterday, there will be a presentation with all the different linkages to different additional materials that you can find to use Invest and QGIS. But we would definitely be in touch with UWI, and if there are other opportunities to deliver further training, we will explore those and we will keep you informed. In the meantime, today's attendance register is online. It's Google Form, so you can find it in the chat. Please fill that in. So Miguel,
I'm trying, but
okay, maybe I can share from my end, and you will tell me when to move the slide.
Okay, thanks.
Okay,
yes.
Let me try that. Share.
That's good. Yeah.
Okay, showing slideshow. Present from beginning. Okay.
Okay.
So Miguel, you can tell me when to move forward.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simone. My name, first let me introduce myself. My name is Miguel Trillo, and I work in one of the companies as partnership for this assignment from the beginning, OIKO. I am an economist, unfortunately, I'm sorry. I'm not a planner, and I'm not an expert on GIS. Our main area of work is evaluating impact, vulnerability, and risk. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, I am an economist, and I am trained on resource economics, environmental impacts, and actually I also teach a course at the university on evaluating risk and impacts, especially on natural resources. My area of economics is the economics of natural resource and environment. And we have, in the recent years, developed also some methodologies to analyze climate change impacts. So I'm going to try to focus on conceptual work, and which is, I think we've decided to bring this section as a complement to the two trainings that you received the previous 2 days. I think from the conceptual perspective, it's interesting to understand what the this model can bring. You know, how can we work with it conceptually? So please, Simone. So we will spend the whole presentation should not be more than 30 minutes. I have some other slides prepared in case there are any questions, but then we can leave some space for an open discussion. I want to cover the concept of climate risk and why does it matter for the purpose of this full training. I want to put climate risk and vulnerability in the context of coastal scenarios as well. And then especially make a distinction between the three concepts that are integrating altogether risk, which are hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. I think it makes sense to understand what we are talking about and how this reverts then into the invest model. Please, Simone, go ahead. Thank you. So, as I said, even though we are covering a more conceptual presentation today, we are reviewing some definitions. I wanted to introduce the presentation with a bridge to these concepts that you've worked on the last few days. We are trying to understand risk in the concept of coastal modeling, of course, and the software that we are using, which is Invest. Of course, risk in the concept of those phenomena like intensification of human activities and changing climate, and what is the relationship between those climate scenarios and a potential impact on human activities in coastal areas, to better understand these relationships, causal relationships if possible. So the course altogether, not today, but the Invest course provides basically a tool, a tool to illustrate reality. But I use the word illustrate because this is basically Invest is a little bit like a metaphor. It's trying to reproduce reality into numbers, quantifying numbers, so we can understand the relationship between variables. Variables being especially those hazards coming from climate. It could be wind, it could be temperature rising, it could be rain, massive rain especially, and the manifestations. And of course, the impact, illustrate the impacts of those into the depending variables, in this case, coastal scenario. It could be all of the assets around the coastal areas, being infrastructure, agriculture, health facilities, of course, population, and even ecosystems. We will cover that as well. So why risk now? Because we are trying to understand how risk is translated into these variables that you have used in the model. So as a summary, vulnerability can be only explained through the calculation of risk. And I want to remind us that it's a metaphor. We're trying to reduce risk into numbers, but it's not perfect. No? So the more we can quantify some of these levels of exposure, the more we can quantify how ready the different populations or affected populations and ecosystems and assets are to respond to the threat. This is resilience, basically. The better we can calculate these relationships between variables. And this is more or less what we are going to do in the presentation today. So please, Simone, thank you. So there are, as I said, and we are going to see this. Yes, this is fine. You can go ahead because we're covering these concepts that we can see here in this graphic. This presentation, actually this slide is not mine. I'm taking this for the fourth panel of the IPCC, the UNDP. This was I think, a very useful presentation, even though it's already almost 20 years old. It's from 2014. And the fourth panel decided to reduce these concepts, reduce as much possible definition, which would be consistent to everyone, to measure, define, and understand risk. No? So this picture, again, it's a little illustration, is basically composed of those three concepts that we will review today: hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And those are the ingredients of risk. In this picture, we can see how on the right hand, we have the variables that are basically the socioeconomic process. On the left hand, we have the climate. You are familiar with these variables because you've seen them in the INVEST model. Natural variability of climate can be, well, some of you probably are familiar with this downscaling. You have stochastic scenarios for climate change in the future. You can reduce this to specific applications into each country, as depending, of course, of the precision of the models. So based on these projections, you translate this into impacts on the different socio-economic processes. We will review this also in a few slides. So basically today, in the next few slides, we will continue by defining hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So please, Simone. So first, vulnerability. It's a situation, of course, where it cannot be defined independently unless you put together the hazard of the danger. It's rain is not it's not a threat unless it's translated into a hazard because of the massive quantity. So vulnerability will be more dependent on whether, for example, we have available any kind of buffer, instruments or mechanism like a sewage system, which would drain that excessive rain. So basically, of course, the conditions of the terrains, those are also variables. And then finally, the exposure. It's not the same to measure or analyze risk in building with hundreds of thousands of people than with a single person exposed. So the level of exposure and the localization of access with assets will also define risk. So risk basically is an uncertainty and surrounding these events, and the more information we have, the better we can define and the precision of the model. So basically, the definition of risk would be that likelihood. Like we can translate all these variables into a percentage, a number. That person, or I should write person or asset, because risk is, of course, also analyzed into not only human beings, but also ecosystems and then also infrastructure, etc. So that likelihood to harm or suffer the adverse effects if exposed to the hazard. So we do need to analyze these separately. Risk is the expression of that likelihood, and usually it's translated into a quantifiable number. Why? Because we can then compare, analyze the variables, and understand whether the different three characteristics or variables are under control, so we can minimize risk in advance. So please, Simone, thank you. Definition of vulnerability, as we've described it, vulnerability is more a quality. It describes circumstances. I mention community infrastructure, systems, assets. As you are aware, the level of sophistication of these characteristics, not only human beings, but also communities and ecosystems, means that they are more vulnerable or prepared. They are susceptible to receiving those effects and damages. No? So I try to classify risk into various dimensions. Of course, there's physical, social, economic, and environment. We will review this later, but the propensity to be adversely affected would be the definition of vulnerability altogether. No? So the lack of capacity to adapt or the weak resilience is also vulnerability. And I put here a few examples that are very illustrative again of vulnerability as a concept. No? Poor design and construction of buildings, or maybe disregard or the use of certain minimum standards on construction patterns. This will obviously later be translated into vulnerability of those assets. Lack of public information and awareness. This is crucial. Simple to understand that a community that has been well organized and prepared and identifies those simple spots where they can be mobilized with a simple early warning system. If the information is there, if everyone in the community has been informed where they have to run, that makes this community group very resilient, very less vulnerable. So this is a basic classification of vulnerability. Early warning systems make communities less vulnerable, and preparedness measures, both infrastructure, etc. So please, Simone. Next. So again, I also provide a few examples, I think, and hope illustrative to summarize these abstract concepts. No? Physical vulnerability, I use the UNISDR because it's a very standardized definition. It's determined such as population density, remoteness of settlements, sites, design and material use for infrastructure and construction and housing, and so on. So there is now something even very concept that comes very handy. It's a circular economy where wooden homes obviously are less likely to be affected by earthquakes, but they are more vulnerable to fire. So depending on the threat, vulnerability also changes. Social vulnerability is very interesting. This has been discussed extensively, especially because some communities are famous for being less vulnerable. In the Caribbean, you have excellent examples on maybe the Cuban, the hydrometeorological system, which has been worked strongly with communities to develop early warning systems. This is just an information system where they have a strong tradition of sensitization with the community, so they are ready when hurricanes, because they are obviously exposed to the hurricanes, they are ready when everything happens. So even though they are very much exposed, sometimes it's surprisingly not affected, because they have this system where people are aware, they work towards their conscience, they have been trained, and this readiness to react is also social density. There is a concept when measuring the social vulnerability called the social capital, which is interesting to understand how communities which have interactions, institutions are stronger. There's Robert Putnam is a major defendant of this concept. So the communities with strong cultural values and a tendency to share also not only values, but also common procedures to respond to threats, they are more vulnerable. So the levels of literacy and education are also important. There are also tools and mechanisms used to understand social vulnerability among communities. Currently, there is actually an ongoing exercise conducted by the 5Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize. They are conducting what's called the CAP. It's a knowledge, awareness, and patterns of attitudes assessment, where they conduct almost a national survey, understanding what are their basically fears against and perceptions and understanding of risk. After you conduct this national survey, you can translate these responses into actually a public awareness campaign. Basically, you can afterwards target a specific actions towards making those communities less vulnerable to climate change, depending, of course, on their responsibilities, social capital, equity, and levels of consciousness. So I hope this is a good example to understand the variable, the social variable of vulnerability. Next, please. So lastly, next, actually, because the environmental is also important, economic vulnerability is important to understand risk as well. And I want to, as I was actually rereading this slide, I want to make a comment which probably might be helpful to understand the concept of. There is a little bit of a misunderstanding here on economic status of individuals, like wealthy people would be more or less vulnerable. No, probably the idea that is intended to communicate here is obviously that poor communities are usually more forced to choose to be exposed to climate disasters because they don't have the resources, they don't have the information, they don't have the means to react and to build that resilience. And they usually decide to build their homes in flooding areas, and they usually can only decide to build their structures with poor quality, and this is obviously what is implied under the concept of economic vulnerability. Squatter settlements are more vulnerable because the land is obviously exposed to floods, and they cannot afford to live in wealthier places. So this is important to understand exposure to risk. The other one and the last one for this section on vulnerability is the environmental vulnerability. We understand how some ecosystems are sensitive, are mature, and they can be a source of protection for flooding. This is a very illustrative example. Wetlands are sensitive to salinity from seawater and pollution from stormwater runoff. All of these key environmental aspects are obviously crucial for deciding how vulnerable ecosystems are. And I bring this to the attention in this presentation because, as you know, the INVEST model also has several variables and indicators that are related to the quality of the ecosystems. Again, the more we represent this quality, this health, ecosystems health, the better we can translate this into a detailed analysis of the relationships between climate and these variables, and of course risk. I want to use an example because I don't think it's in this presentation. Can you please move on? Please, Simone, just 1 second. Thank you. Yes, it's not here. Move back just 1 second so we can move to this one now. Before we move ahead, in my presentation, I wanted actually to bring the attention to environmental vulnerability with another example. Our team, OpenPlan and OIKO, we worked recently in the Caribbean in one very illustrative example on how the environment can be actually also quantified. As we conducted an ecosystem service valuation where the services provided by ecosystems were relevant to understand not only the economic value, but the compensatory value. So to have an illustration on how the different services provided by, for example, mangrove, in terms of protection, in terms of food, in terms of shelter of biodiversity of species which have a commercial value, or even touristic activities which were being held around the mangroves or in the coastal areas that were crucial for the development of those economic activities where so many inhabitants were dependent. No? So environmental vulnerability is not yet, it's not only the ecosystem and the biodiversity species they host, it's also the relationships of the economic surrounding species, systems depending on those sources of incomes, or those species that have a value for nature, for sightseeing, for enjoying the. So wetlands are sensitive because of course they protect. Coral reefs are sensitive. Sometimes they are even valued as they have also the protection. They secure the protection or the equivalent of a construction dike. Those are examples on how some of the ecosystems can be valued and can be translated into relevant assets that obviously are very much related to risk. I just wanted to give this as an example of how vulnerability is related to risk, and how different ecosystems can be extremely valuable and not always measured to understand risk and the exposure of these ecosystems and assets to the threats of climate, and how we can translate, of course, these variables in our invest model. So now, yes, we can go ahead and go to the next one, please. Next, Simon. Thank you. So as I think I want to summarize here, or at least bring some conclusions of our definition, because these conceptual definitions were in the framework of INVEST. As you can see, INVEST model uses vulnerability as a variable. Again, we like to believe that this vulnerability index is it's a metaphor, it's a simile, but it represents as much as we can the reality, and it helps us to understand the different levels of risk. So bringing down all of these variables to numbers helps us understand risk and measure these relationships. So a climate vulnerability index is typically combining a group of indicators. Sometimes, as here, you can weight them, you can compose several indicators to represent vulnerability. Again, I remind everyone that this is an exercise, it's a metaphor. The better the metaphor illustrates and represents reality, the better we will be able to analyze those variables. But this is subject to, it's not perfect. We can decide to use these different indicators, but we are also flexible to introduce other indicators as needed. Of course, today we are reviewing these that are used in the INVEST model to follow with the exercises and training that you received and conducted the last few days. No? So I am just summarizing here in this matrix the ranks. No? We have physical, remember physical vulnerability on geomorphology, which relieves. We also have the natural habitats. We talk about how they are relevant for risk, sea level change, of course, wave exposure and surge potential. Those are the variables used in the model. And then there is a classification of risk, and there is a translation of those variables that are affected into different levels of risk, no? Very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. And this is exercise is what allows us to make some conclusions on the level of risk in the different coastal areas. I don't think we should maybe extend this slide too much. But I think it's illustrative enough, but we can open some questions later if needed. And I personally think that we should perhaps, please go ahead. Yes, there are only a few more definitions, and then we can make a pause. And so we've reviewed the definition of risk and vulnerability. Then exposure is it's the other dimension of risk, which is very much related to people, livelihood, species, ecosystems, environmental functions. As I described the services, sometimes I've forgotten. Ecosystems provide relevant services for society. They also need to be included in the exposure definition, and of course risk, infrastructure, economic and social, even cultural assets. So that all of those could be adversely affected by hazard. And as much as they are exposed, they will be part of this equation. So just to conclude, this information helps decision making. So the more information we have on the variables and the relationship between them, even if it's just an illustration, the better decisions we can make. No? Coastal managers, planners, landowners, so we can analyze the risk and the coastal hazards. So next, please. This is again the illustration. I use this to close this first part of the presentation, just to summarize how the impacts are related. The three dimensions of risk. This is systematization, which is relatively simple to translate into variables. The natural variability, this is given data based on the climate scenarios. There is both adaptation and mitigation actions. I think or exercise with invest model relates more to the adaptation, and governance, which we've also reviewed, how communities and their capability of managing risk and anticipating risk is very relevant to prevent the impacts from happening. So please, next one. I think last one. Yes, this is just a framework for managing vulnerability and risk, which summarizes the exercise for systematic assessment of risk and diagnosis of the sources of risk and the three variables. They call, usually it's called vulnerability assessment, risk vulnerability assessment. And just please remember that it has these three variables, and of course is composed of physical, economic, environmental, and social. So the drivers need to be reflecting all of those variables. And I think this is the last slide. Please, next, Simone, thank you. Yes, I closed this section. I think we covered in a half an hour the conceptual framework for the invest model, with just a sentence of one of the pioneers of risk management. So the only alternative to risk management is crisis management, which obviously is more expensive, time-consuming, and embarrassing. So I hope it was clear. How should we proceed? Simone, do you suggest we leave some space and for open discussions? Do you want to leave room for questions?
Yeah, I think we could get, well, first of all, take some question on your presentation, if we can, and later we can move on with our discussion. But if there is any questions on the definitions that Miguel gave us, please ask, and we'll have a short discussion on that.
Miguel, can I just ask a question? I might be a bit out of order, but the table of risk that you showed us with the factors that were described by percentiles.
Yes.
Would the data for those percentiles be specific to each island or to a region, or are they universal? So, for instance,
definitely yes. Mm-hmm. We can go back to the slides, please, Simone.
Yes.
Yes, because this is an attempt to standardize, so we can have comparative measures on different countries, but this needs to be, of course, relative to each country, not only because coral reefs are, for example, non-natural habitats. The role they play in different communities and different societies is very different. Not only the coral reefs is of different quality, but also the relationship with the ecosystems altogether, and the role they play in providing services is different. So I would suggest that first, the selection of these biodiversity component of the ecosystem, then the density of the ecosystems is different, then the quality of types of mangroves. So I think, yes, I think this is a good reference. Simone and I use this specific data from the different case studies to construct this table. So this is just one example, but it cannot be considered universal. Even I would say, I know this is questionable as well, but even the classification of very low, low, and moderate, it's difficult to make this universal. I think percentiles are very useful. 20% makes a lot of sense because you have 5 different levels or degrees, but perceptions of risk is different. I think this is an attempt to standardize and to make decisions, but it's not. This is why I use, and I understand this is also my interpretation. I use the word metaphor. We cannot forget that this is just a representation of reality. The more and the better we represent it, of course, the better results the model can bring about. No? But I don't think this is universal. This should be used and specifically completed and embedded in each of the countries. No, of course, the percentiles, yes, but the contents of and the characteristics of the different ranks, from relief, wave, exposure, etc. This is probably something that needs to be discussed in each of the case studies, and some of them will be very similar, but yes.
Thank you.
I think there is a question from Dr. Leo Brewster. Please, Dr. Brewster, go ahead.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm really intrigued by the use of those indicators for the vulnerability assessment. And I was just wondering whether or not they are actually independently reflected in the INVEST mapping process, or are they combined in some format to come up with an actual index number that can then be reflected for space or sections of coastline? And what sort of methodology you use to combine them, whether or not it's the one that was used where you take the square root of the indicators and divide by the number, or the other one where you just add up and multiply that sort of thing. Because right. those indicators are standardized for most coastal vulnerability assessments. And there are others that can obviously be added in because they're supposed to provide yes. ease of use in terms of visually descriptive and easy to understand mechanisms, you know. So I was just wondering how it's reflected then in the INVEST software. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I can answer that. So they are individually reflected in and spatially referenced in the INVEST model. So what the INVEST model outputs is for each of the shore point, it will provide the rank for each of the different classes. So that if there is 6 or 7 independent variables that he has used. And then he brings those 6 or 7 variables, depending on how you have structured the model, to synthesis into a synthetic value. Synthetic meaning like a single value. And that is the geometric mean of the different ranks. So that's the equation we saw yesterday and the day before when we were looking at the model. So in the INVEST, those variables, which are common to other vulnerability assessment methodologies, are rendered as are quantified using the table that Miguel just showed, and eventually brought to a single value that is specific to each section of the coastline. So it can be visualized in GIS, and I think we did that yesterday a bit, using colors, using color coding according to the values he actually gets. So yes, they can be visualized independently. They can be visualized as a synthetic value, a synthesis.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think there was one other hand raised. I noticed that. Not sure if there was...
Leo. I think it's Leo.
Okay, now I thought I saw another one. Is there any other question? Any other comment? Okay. Well, if not, I think I like to invite Jonathan McHugh to lead us in the second part of this afternoon, where we would like to explore with you potential uses of the knowledge we learn in the last couple of days. John, please, you could introduce yourself, and I think you will be helped by Yolanda in leading the conversation. So if Yolanda can introduce herself as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Yeah, I'm John McHugh, the ICZM specialist on the team, and with Yolanda and Steve, we're going to use the next period of time to allow you to give us your views on your experiences from your various countries. I'm going to sort of kick the next session off with just a 20-minute discussion on some case examples of where Invest has been used, and to identify sort of how we can sort of learn the lessons from some of these case examples, learn from yourselves as to what you've learned and witnessed over the last couple of days, to elaborate and to move forward, and to allow you to consider real good examples of next steps for each of your countries to improve coastal risk management and the vulnerability assessments, which Miguel has identified in the previous talk. So I'm just going to share my screen now and give you an idea of the way we're going to be sort of moving this forward. You may recall on day one that I was looking at how to identify some of the key questions, national experience. And you'll be able to see here the ideas that we were developing. And as I know, some of you on this training list are decision makers. Some of you are not, and some of you are aspirational decision makers. But we're still looking to try and understand what would be sort of the appropriate scale of data that needs to come out. What would be the most appropriate type of information that's going to be needed? And importantly, then what level of accuracy is needed? And Miguel's discussion has sort of elicited the importance of understanding indicators to determine the most suitable sets of vulnerability and exposure and risk indices that are actually going to be needed. So I'd like you to sort of consider that as I give the next sort of series of...
We can't hear you anymore, John.
Really? I hope you can still hear.
I can hear him well.
Yeah, I can.
I can hear also.
Sorry, that was my problem then. Okay.
That's no problem.
Apologies.
All right. Don't worry. Yeah, so the next few slides are going to give you an idea of what has been used in the past. I'm going to use two examples, one from Belize and one from the Bahamas. Now, Belize was kind of at the forefront alongside Barbados on setting up ICZM planning in the region. And in 2016, they'd set up their ICZM plan. And interestingly, this is being updated as we speak. But to the right-hand side, you'll see that Belize is also moving into what's called maritime economy planning, and a document with UK-funded money has been established to determine how its blue economy should be framed. And they have been using a lot of the information from the INVEST model to formulate its pillars of success. So the Belize example of the ICZM plan was interesting because it was one of the first examples that did adopt the scenario suite of softwares, which Simone has alluded to the last couple of days, to help structure its approach for its Belize coastal management approach. The determined approach was basically allowing a participatory approach to set informed scenarios. I won't be talking about how the software was actually run from a methodology point of view, but the critical point to raise here is that it is not just pressing buttons that's making policy decisions. A lot of these scenarios that you see on the screen here were developed through very close and detailed participatory management processes that involved all sectors of society in all parts of the country that have different aspirations, sector expectations, policies and regulations. So out of the participatory approach, 3 scenario options were presented and tested through INVEST. As on the left-hand side, you can see that there was an all-green scenario, which was looking at a best practice conservation approach. The middle approach was I'll move to the right-hand side. The development scenario was making the economic drivers the priority for Belize. So it was looking at what's going to be needed from a commercial perspective, from a development perspective, from a fishing perspective, so that the economic maxima is delivered for the country. In between, there was a combination of the two, and this is what was called the informed management approach. Now, that was combining probably the current situation in about 2015 and progressively considering what was going to be happening in the next 5 years. So as you've been hearing from Simone and during the training sessions over the last few days, the information that goes into INVEST has to be as recent as possible, and it needs to be accurate and to the most appropriate scales. So you can demonstrate what the current sector positions are. You can demonstrate what the aspirations of those sectors are going to be. And then you can bring a scenario cloak around that to say, wouldn't it be good if we could really green our approach, or we don't have any option, we've actually got to move forward and get as much development as possible. All those scenarios can be tested. Importantly, they can be mapped. And even more importantly, the output of those maps can actually be used to inform decision-making on the ground. So the 2016 ICZM plan for Belize was very useful to help craft the story, help position the information, and to sort of articulate to decision makers what the preferred approach would be. So INVEST from the Belize perspective was useful in a number of ways. And you can see on the screen, there were about 6 benefits of this. And it's just reinforcing the value of scenario setting and how INVEST as a tool could be useful, not just for ICZM, but for national planning in general. Firstly, the scenario approach helped to a range of stakeholders to understand how a variety of different human activities are affecting ecosystems, their services, both currently and in the future. So as Miguel articulated, it's understanding what the vulnerabilities are from an environmental, social, and an economic perspective to be able to sort of project different scenario human activities, whether they're going to be increasing or whether they're going to be decreasing, whether they're going to be expanding or whether they're going to be changing. And that would actually is helping a decision maker to position themselves in terms of how rigid a policy needs to be. Secondly, it helped to make sure that policymakers were able to compare the different planning options. In any government situation where you're setting a new strategy, where you're setting policy or a new national plan, there needs to be a rigid decision-making process. And the INVEST tool in this situation is quite a useful model to at least set some images and some stories for decision-making to take place. Thirdly, this scenario development was useful to open the door for discussion, and it allowed all stakeholders to basically understand why it's being done. It makes them understand a way forward within communicating what the planning process is, and critically allows stakeholders to learn from their knowledge and to learn how others have to abide to their regulations. So the whole thing of storytelling here is critical, and it's a really good way that INVEST can offer a service. From the Belize perspective, the selection was to go down an informed management approach. I'm not here to talk about what that physically means, but it's basically improving the current situation in a more sustained manner. And it's better to achieve the goals of the ICZM mandate than going down a pure green route, which is going to be stifling economic development, or down a more grey route, total development, and thus impacting on environmental sustainability. So this iterative process of scenario creation made it possible to manually optimize the resulting zoning scheme that was set up and achieve the ICZM intended outcomes. So again, that keyword iterative in terms of the process it basically is implying that we have to learn as we're going along. The INVEST tool, as has been said over the last few days, is just a tool. There are many other tools out there, but if it does help to support to communicate some of an improvement from what was done last year, then that tool really has an importance. Finally, the scenarios have provided a foundation for future planning and monitoring change against defined and nationally supported, cabinet supported goals and policies. So that kind of structure using the INVEST tool is quite a useful example to define. Some of you on the call may have been working with Belize, and so it would be good to get your views on how successful your perspective has been. But this is just one quick case example to show. A second one, I'm going to use Bahamas. And again, more recently, through the work of the Nature Conservancy, through the Natural Capital Project, which was IDB funded, and the role of Stanford University in the US, managed to use INVEST to the best effect on Andros Island. Andros Island is the largest island in the Bahamas. It's the green island. And a particular focus was being placed on how ecosystem service delivery can be at the forefront of setting up the Andros Sustainable Development Plan. So a lot of information needed to be collected. So as an early phase of data collection, as you've been hearing over the last few days, that then set the structure for an important phase then of participatory consultation. And similar to the Belizean situation, the work in Andros was highly participatory. And the success of any INVEST work is diluted quite significantly if your participatory model is not robust, it's not fully engaging, and it is not capturing the true communal views on specific topics. So you can see on the screen the fact that this is just an output that TNC had produced in terms of their participatory planning workshop events, but this is a one style of map. And you may have heard me on day one saying, okay, what does a map mean? Well, as you can see on the screen, this is not an invest output map, but it's a critical map that's feeding in to a successful invest model. The invest model subsequent software packages will allow the scenario development to take place, but those scenario developments are useless unless it's capturing communal views, concerns, as well as aspirations. Similar to Belize, a series of scenarios were set. This was, again, looking at a business as usual on the left-hand side, through to a green conservation focus, a sustainable prosperity scenario, and on the right-hand side, an intensive development scenario. All of these had to sort of maximize available data. It managed to come up with proxy data sets where specific information wasn't available. And importantly, it had to use the power of intuition in certain situations to project in the future what, for example, intensive development is potentially on the horizon. So in order to sort of bring all those together, data is the critical set of rules that need to go into this. Where you don't have data, you must be able to be robust in your thinking for putting forward proxy analyses as appropriate. So the main findings from Bahamas were that a sustainable prosperity scenario became the selected scenario option. It then became the backbone of the Sustainable Development Master Plan, which was set up and Cabinet endorsed in 2017. This generated a really important roadmap for the Bahamas, and particularly for Androsians, to prioritize their biodiversity and ecosystem service delivery on the ground, whilst being able to use this Sustainable Development Master Plan to report against the SDGs. So the INVEST tool has allowed to springboard into a range of other support, monitoring and evaluation processes to help decision makers in the future. And importantly, and probably something which is even more important post-COVID-19, by pursuing this, it led to the mobilization of $35 million in loans on coastal management related activities, $3 million of which was specifically directed to more ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solution infrastructures, which are now looking to be implemented on the ground on Andros Island. And linked to this with regard to zoning and conservation protection, good amounts of money were being able to piggyback on the back of this report, on this plan, for the management of marine protected areas, not just on Andros, but to create ecological networks across the other islands, family islands of the Bahamas. So you can see that there's a suite of interesting case studies which are out there, which we have been aware of through this consultancy and are sort of bringing together now for discussion with yourselves. And whilst I sort of tee up my co-colleagues Yolanda and Steve, there are three questions which I'm going to sort of leave you all with to sort of start to consider, and it may be useful to elicit discussion in the chat box. The first is, what upcoming planning projects in your country do you feel may well benefit from setting up or testing or trialing the INVEST model in terms of supporting participatory planning and decision making on the ground? Secondly, do you feel your nation has the necessary coastal information to make this actually work? And as I've said in the Belizean and Bahamas example, there are situations where quite a bit of proxy data needed to be utilized, and that's not necessarily a fault of models such as INVEST. If you're clever enough and we designing suitable indicators and the understanding of a proxy data set is made clear, then it's not a problem to have that as part of your data model. And thirdly, and linked very strongly to the reason for us undertaking this training, is from your country's perspective, what additional capacity or research needs are going to be required to maximize the potential for INVEST models to be effective? I'll leave those questions open. I'll stop sharing my screen, but I will come back to those questions after I allow Yolanda and Steve to have a quick comment. So Simone, I'll pass back to yourself and I'll allow Yolanda and Steve to sort of add to my initial points.
Thank you, John. So thank you for the very interesting presentation and for the engaging questions that you put on your screen that we will come back to. Yolanda and Steve, if you have any comment on that before we open the discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Simone. Just to introduce myself, Yolanda Aline, and I am a land use planner based in Barbados, and have done a lot of work with respect to land use planning across the CARICOM member states, looking particularly at how we can reduce our vulnerability to disasters, because we are one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. So I think, John, your presentation really drew attention to the importance of getting a very wide cross-section of views to make those decisions for long term for our country, looking at how the scenarios can help us to build trends and see spaces being used in different ways, and then coming up with what do we really want. And the participatory function of it, to me, it was very, very intriguing, because that speaks to governance and who's involved in the process. So I kind of like that, and I would like to hear as we get into the conversation from some of the participants about how they see that model working with respect to informing the communities, the various communities at stake, about their vulnerability and about what they would like to see happen. So thank you for that.
Sure. Can I make a comment then, John? Just to sort of start the discussion. I really liked your reference to the potential for using models like INVEST as a basis for storytelling, and I think that's something that can sometimes be overlooked in the planning process. That it's fundamentally about telling a story of how a place could be and how a place should be, how you want it to be, and identifying where those things diverge. And I think the way that models of this type can help you to get that story right in your mind and then convey it to decision makers is a really important part of it. Similarly, as Yolanda said, I think the importance of stakeholders' participation that you mentioned can't really be overemphasized. I think that's critical because again, if you take the view that the stakeholders, particularly local stakeholders, may not be experts in modelling, may not be experts in planning, but they are the experts in those places, then their inputs are crucial to both the modelling process and the subsequent planning process. So I'd be interested to hear what experience people have got of that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think on the in the audience today, it will be really good, because the next generation, I know I don't look old enough. I know it, you know, I'm getting into the old category now. What I'm interested is to see the new generation, how they can use tools, whether it's Invest, whether it's in Barbados, for example, it's the National Coastal Risk Platform or similar ones, you know, how these tools can be picked up by the new generation, the postgrads on this course, and turned into something which is going to be valuable for future planning post 2030. I think that's going to be the critical point. The participatory input will not change. You know, that really has been critical decades ago, and it'll be equally more important in the decades to come. It's just how that message is conveyed. And like I said, you know, on day one, you know, what is a map? The different interpretations can be construed in different ways, but basically, if that map cannot get the information across to the key people, it's a failed map. So I'd be interested to hear from anybody in the chat room, their perspectives of some of the challenges or some of the really good examples of where a participatory approach has worked, and how a map, either through Invest or another tool, has or has not been used effectively. I see Fabian's hand up from Barbados. I wasn't sure if I can invite Fabian to give me his views.
See here. Hi. Hello to all. Yes, I definitely agree that the tools such as the QGIS and Invest can be critically important in the decision-making process. We would have tried it a few years ago now in terms of looking at natural capital, the value of our resources, quarries, etc., and trying to apply it within a policy framework. The limitations, of course, were the availability of data to inject into that. But certainly, as you project into the future, in terms of what is planned at a national level, you're looking at renewable energy in terms of offshore wind, possibilities of offshore wave, in terms of how our new physical development plan seeks to integrate climate change adaptation principles into it. And as you know, in planning, in terms of retreat and accommodation, the combination of both, where you try to integrate setback policies, and in terms of adaptation, in terms of existing infrastructure, how can that adapt to accommodate climate change? I think that when you look at the sum total of all the social and economic infrastructure in place and how they overlap in terms of the zones of influence of coastal hazards, for example, tools such as the one demonstrated through this conference can play an important role in the decision-making process, but of course, as it relates to how it can also influence the evolution of policy and how we govern. So that's just my few thoughts I have sitting and looking at the proceedings over the last 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. Anybody else with any specific questions? I mean, linking through to Fabian or any planners on this event. You saw from my example from Belize that I had the tendency to offer zoning as a classic planner's tool and to provide some early indications of where zones may stop. Now, from a planner's perspective, that could be quite useful, but also potentially quite dangerous because the information may not be accurate enough to define spatial limits. And if that's the case, I'd be interested to hear people's views as to where does an Invest model start and stop to provide a planner with that decision-making information? don't know whether Steve or Yolanda maybe have a specific view on that topic.
I was thinking as you were speaking, John, that the model often the model may not have all the data required. And I think it is almost like you're constantly supplementing with on the ground work. You have to be constantly getting data from communities, participants, and from multiple sources to help buoy it up or use the proxy data. But it seems to me that it can become quite a complex process for some agencies and for some regions where you are doing two things and you're already sometimes on the resource. You're trying to build up the model, but you're also trying to gather data from people who are in a life situation on the ground in communities, business community, living community, and in very vulnerable areas in our coastal zone. So I'm wondering if anybody has had the experience of trying to gather data to help give inputs to a model where they've found challenges and would like to share that and perhaps some solutions, maybe they were able to overcome that. If you could share your experience, that would be helpful. Everybody's very quiet this afternoon. Is it the after lunch session?
Yolanda's point, sorry, carry on where that call was coming from.
Leonard? Is that Leonard?
Yes, it's Leonard. I'm
good. Go ahead.
And I'm learning.
You're muted.
No, Yolanda, I was just saying and I'm telling you, it's not being quiet. It's actually learning. And I did hear what you say. It's okay.
Okay, all right, that's all right. Anyone else wants to share on the project? The first question that John had thrown out there, are there any planning projects coming up? Because as planners, we're always looking to what the future, we're planning for the future 10, 15 years out. And sometimes we can see a pattern of development taking place. Is there anything happening that perhaps you can benefit from in your country in terms of using this model that could help you with it?
I think Thera Edwards has raised her hand.
Okay.
Possible links to planning because I've already had some chat.
Sorry, can you say that again? I don't think we're hearing you very well.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a project that's sort of winding up now that was looking at vulnerability and risk assessment for 5 sectors in Jamaica. The coastal sector was one of the sectors, and because of how the information is distributed in terms of across agencies, areas of focus, I could see where this model would be useful to pull together some of the data sets that we had been working with in a somewhat disconnected way, and trying to find a way to combine the values to arrive at an overall vulnerability for the sector. So we had used mangroves, seagrass, coral. For the coral reefs, we had some health information. So we had the TNC data set, and we had some health information using reef check data. We had some erosion monitoring sites around the island. And then it was how to come up with this overall vulnerability for the coastal area, looking primarily at the hazards of storm surge, hurricane wave heights, to a lesser extent, sea surface temperature. So I've been actually listening quite keenly over the past 2 days and looking at what was being done with the data sets, trying to evaluate if using these data sets or the data sets that we had in hand, and with some further processing, they could be put into the model to give us that answer that we were trying to get using other methods.
And had you come to a conclusion one way or the other on that? Or
Well, yes. So I think it's possible, and certainly to give, just because of also something else that I received today, to come up with some of the scoring values that you would need to put into the background tables to the model, and to do the data conversions, you know, like to create the shape files for the distribution of, say, the mangrove areas, that it would be possible to use this model to come up with what we were trying to do. The challenge is when the project is closing and the time it would take to work on the data sets.
what on gathering the data in the first place? Or in
No, the data is gathered. It's just the conversion
Right,
of it
okay.
that would be, yeah.
Have you got any thoughts on that, Simone?
No, I think we explored yesterday a bit how to do what we were just discussing in terms of the data set. So I think there are opportunity there, but I understand almost the frustration of knowing that there is more to do with a tool like this, but not having the time and the resources to explore that route, because obviously there are other projects coming across. There is a variety of different tasks that we need to perform on a daily basis. I think we've been working with several Caribbean departments in the past few years, and one fil rouge that I can find is that each department has a lot to do, and not enough time to potentially deepen or explore some different application of something that has been learning in trainings like this one. Absolutely. So that I think a recommendation for generally for the way departments and projects are run is that they should accommodate for some time after the end of the project and some resources to further explore and further cement inclusion of these models into the workflow, and even improvement and betterment of those.
Yeah, that's great.
I would certainly put that in as a recommendation, that what we did was a starting point, and now having been exposed to the capabilities of this model, that with time, it should be used to refine the results of what had been done.
Yeah, I think it was Miguel who used the word iterative in his presentation, and I think you do need to see it in that way. You start using it with what information that you've got available, and then you get to understand how it can be used, and hopefully then as you use it more often, there's better information coming in, and the whole thing works better as you go on.
Picking up on Vera's point, what is interesting, because we are moving into a nice part, we're moving in very seamlessly into the part of the today's presentation, which is talking about future research. Just so the audience are aware, that what may be useful to know is that there are obviously different funding modalities to move this forward. IDB have been extremely supportive in this instance. There's a new initiative that the UK government are looking to be starting into later this year, and it's called the Blue Planet Fund, and it is supporting nations globally on a range of climate resilient and blue economy related projects. Now, this Blue Planet Fund, to the tune of £500 million, will be looking for regions to come together with their thoughts on what's going to be needed, as long as it complies with the Blue Planet Fund criteria. But the main focus of that is basically people, climate and nature. So the role of an invest model to potentially support nations or regions, and I'm looking at you all as the Caribbean region here, to potentially come up with Blue Planet Fund compliant projects where an invest model could be used, could hit at least 2 or 3 important markers. It would certainly provide support with climate resilient planning for all countries. And secondly, it could be used to support capacity building. So whilst you may not be aware of it, my question to you all, linking through to our discussion now on sort of future research and kind of next steps, would be to get to know whether any of you on the call were aware of the Blue Planet Fund, or whether you know of sort of embryonic concepts that could be used, adapted, or sort of massaged into place that we could, consider to move forward to the IDB for future recommendation, plus also to other donors. So my question is anybody aware of the Blue Planet Fund? And if not, it would be, if you are interested in learning more, it would, we could probably help with some links there.
Hi, John, Leo here.
Hi, Leo.
I am not aware of the Blue Planet Fund, but I would be very interested in learning some more because I think Barbados Coastal Zone Management Unit would be very interested in trying to start looking to see how we can apply invest to some of the activities that we're doing now, especially in representation, giving consideration to the fact that we've just completed our updated coastal zone plan, and the sort of information that we have been able to compile would feed in nicely in some respects, but there are some data gaps that we would also have to look to fill in. And I think it is an ideal approach that could be used for the type of work that we are doing that has other spin-off benefits for other sectors as well. So I would be very interested to learn some more and see how we could be involved, especially if a regional project is being considered for development. I can put my hand now and say Barbados would be interested.
Yeah, great. I think as I know sort of how the structure of your ICZM plan, I can really see where potentially aspects of this Blue Planet Fund, if Barbados as a country in tandem with others sort of joined forces to recommend need in compliance with their criteria, I could see quite an interesting avenue opening. So I will, I'll drop you a line on that one and let you know what the latest is on the Blue Planet Fund.
I think is Joan Norville here from OECS? I don't know whether Joan.
Yes.
Are you? Do you know if OECS is aware of the Blue Planet Fund?
I'm sorry. Do I?
Sorry. Do you know if OECS is aware of the Blue Planet Fund?
The Green Planet Fund? No.
Blue
Climate Fund?
It's the Blue Planet Fund.
Oh, the Blue Climate Fund. I'm not too sure. I would have to check with my oceans persons.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, John.
No, not at all. The sort of generic question about capacity, linking climate resiliency through to the new aspects of marine spatial planning and blue economy development it does go hand in hand with our discussion and our training focus because, and I know that the Blue Planet Fund is prioritizing vulnerable nations and nations with a desire to update its systems in line with all SDGs, but particularly SDG 13 and 14. So I think that there's interesting scope there, and whether Invest has a role there, I believe it potentially does. It could provide a useful opportunity. So we'll bring that into the into our reports.
And I was thinking, John, as you were speaking, a big benefit is just the collaboration across island states, or countries. That whole regional approach that Leo alluded to, I think that's where I think the CARICOM states can really benefit from sharing their skill sets and sharing their knowledge and working together towards a common basis, a common goal, sorry.
I see Kevin in Antigua and Barbuda is sort of asking how Antigua and Barbuda might benefit from this. Is there sort of basic information that you could provide, John, that would?
Yeah, there's some generic information. Yeah. What I would need to know from Kevin is, my understanding is whether Antigua is compliant or whether it falls within donor, the donor criteria. I don't know if Antigua's progressed into middle income status. There may be a bit of an issue there, but I'd be happy to send you, likewise to Leo in Barbados, some information on that. But as Yolanda said, I think that the regional approach would actually be a very sensible strategy to consider.
Maybe if you have a link, perhaps you can drop a link in the chat, John, if you have one.
Yeah, it's
just to get basic information, and then people can explore beyond that.
Yeah,
I'll have to search it, but I will send it. If it's not now, okay. I'll do it. Simone, I'm not sure how we want to move from here. Whether you wish to allow questions or to.
No, definitely. I like to allow questions. I like to prompt the participants to tell us how they were thinking of using Invest in their work. We have mentioned that a bit right now, but if there is anyone else that wants to share how they feel this could be helpful for their work, I think Werner Usen has raised your hand, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, good afternoon.
Okay, well, I'm a physical planning officer from St. Lucia, and I work in the Department of Planning. Currently in St. Lucia, we operate without any national or any approved land use plan. But what we normally use, we use our act and our development guides when we deal with planning. We have a very good cadastral system in St. Lucia, so it assists us in being able to do land use planning while it's not formalized, but it's somewhat done in a formal way. Presently, my department is working on a Queen's Chains policy. For the benefit of those who don't know, well, we do have Queen's Chain in St. Lucia, and it's basically was placed there when St. Lucia and France were involved in the battle. So before independence, we had 7 times British, 7 times French, and that whole Queen's Chain came about when the French more or less used that to guard the entry ports and entry areas to the island. So, but what has been happening of late is that persons, well, those lands is delineated. There's a boundary of 186 feet from the high water mark inland, and that is what defines the Queen's Chain. So we're working on a policy presently that will be able to assist us with ensuring that every citizen has that right to actually derive benefit from the Queen's Chain. So the Cabinet of Ministers has now asked of the Department of Planning to create a policy, and I mean, I'm very intrigued by some of what came out from the model and even what persons shared. And I think that based on what I've just learned, I'm not very proficient in the use of QGIS and GIS, but our department, we have a unit dealing with that. So that may be an opportunity I can share with them. But I think that Invest seems to have some relevance with regards to the Queens developing the Queenston's policy. I don't know how it can be used really now, but I think it shows based upon what I've noticed, because as a Queen's chain is more or less like it's coastal lands. So there is benefit in terms of what we'll be able to add, what additional value to be able to add to our policy. So I may have to contact one of you, just know that you could guide me and probably have some kind of presentation to my department at some point, even though via Zoom or something. I think it's very interesting. I'm pretty pleased and just wanted to share that with the colleagues and the persons at the training right now. Thank you.
Thank you. So, sorry, can I just ask you? So, the Queen's Chain policy, is that equivalent then to a coastal zone management policy, or is it more? Is it tighter than that?
Well, it would fall under the umbrella of a coastal zone policy, but this one is particularly to deal with Queen's Chain and coastal lands. Reason being, we've had a lot of controversy back home with the Queen's Chain being leased to hotel developers, right. and anytime the hotel developers leases the Queen's Chain, then it becomes a problem of access.
Yeah.
And persons in St. Lucia, it's known that the Queen's Chain is an open access resource, and it's owned by the Crown, and the beach is open access. Most places the Queen's Chain have beach, some other places there are cliff, but persons still need to derive that benefit. And anytime you lease it to foreigners or to hotel owners or developers, there becomes a problem. And of late, we've had lots of problems. I mean, there is one of the major projects we have back home. I don't know if persons have, it's probably all over the news. It's a carbon development. It's a development company from Canada, and they are presently doing development home. While persons are pro-development, you tend to find that persons still clamoring about having access to the beach, and anytime the developers come in, it's always a problem. So we are asked to put together a Queen's Chain policy that would help guide the policymakers and also the investors, that when you come in, you are guided by this policy, and hopefully the policy becomes law, and so we set regulations and everything, because we are guided by the Planning and Development Act, and we normally use different referrals when we approve developments. And when you have policies lying all over the place and it's not legislated, then again, it's just a document on a shelf. So we're trying to ensure we have something that would more or less fortify what we have. So I just think that based on what I've heard from the presentations and even from the training, I think Invest seems to have a lot of relevance and importance. And I think it's something to look forward to, so that, we could utilize when we come to put together our policy.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yolanda, do you have is there a similar issue in Barbados? And
I think you need to speak to Dr. Brewster. Is there a similar issue in Barbados with respect to Crown lands and access and development?
Presumably there's no Queen's Chain now.
No, there's no, we've never had the Queen's Chain.
Not Queen's Chain.
But we have a setback requirement that is similarly being encroached on predominantly by developers as well. And we often have a hard time trying to enforce it. And we have the issue as well in terms of mixed use access concerns and the rights of the public being prevented from accessing areas, principally because according to our law, the common law principle, the property owner owns up to the high water mark, but then you have to set back the 30 meters or 100 feet from high water mark for construction. And I think it's 10 meters or 30 feet for any enclosures or fences from the high water mark position. And therefore areas of the dry beach then become inaccessible when hotels put down all their beach chairs and only allow the foreshore as accessible space for the public to use, which is the wet beach. right? So there's always some level of conflict there. So yeah, it's similar, but slightly different. But same principle again, in terms of encroachment on setbacks and not adhering. But invest for me has always been of keen interest to me and to the office in general, in terms of how we can use it to capture information, especially the economic and the like shoreline protection characteristics and those sort of things. When we first saw it for Belize, we were really intrigued, and then we also followed up when Bahamas had done it as well. So, you know, it was a question then of not necessarily having sufficient information for input, but having seen this presentation here, I'm quite sure that we have some of the relevant information now that we can start to look to populate. And then, provided it is not a compressed program, but you know, if it's over 3 years, then we will have sufficient time to accurately assimilate and accumulate the information necessary to have a really useful system.
You're spot on, Leo, and I know we've had discussions over the past, but the fact that Barbados has a risk resilient ICZM plan now set up, there was discussion about sort of compartmentalizing your sub areas and having more detailed, granular shoreline management plans, for want of a better word, that actually where an invest model could really be quite valuable, because we can bring in that data at a sub area level. And for Werner's perspective in St. Lucia, yes, I'm aware of the Queen's Chain scenario, which was well articulated by Leo. But another issue that St. Lucia does have is that it had set up a beach management system about sort of 15 years ago, which allowed issues of the Queen's Chain to embrace safety on the coast as well. Because you quite rightly said, when leases happen and you know, you get new hotel ownerships, we don't need to mention names, but when we have new overseas hotels coming in, that issue of safety on public lands for all St. Lucians is diluted. So whether invest could be used to also you know, demonstrate some of the risk implications for beach users, that in its own right could be a useful exercise to support the Queen's Chain policy, even if you separate it from a more national ICZM policy, which I know St. Lucia has, but I think it needs a bit of love and update. But what St. Lucia also has are a suite of sector-specific action plans, the SASAPs. And I think those sector SASAPs could be useful to sort of demonstrate how a Queen's Chain policy needs to update that from a climate resilience perspective. So, because the Queen's Chain at the moment doesn't really embrace how things are going to change in the future, and that's where invest could be useful.
I think there are a couple of comments in the chat. There are some mentioning still on the fact that Antigua experiences some conflict and dispute over beach access, like Barbados and St. Lucia, and the idea of setback was to allow for public access, but there is a recognition that invest sounds a very useful tool. And there is a mention here about the fact that in Antigua, the Forest Environmental Division uses QGIS for mapping areas. And then there is another one that I think they're kind of linked somehow from Ms. Norville about whether the OECS should start using standardized tools and data collection, both at regional level and within countries. And the fact that different agencies use different tools, and that the invest is a promising tool there, and potentially even QGIS could be a promising tool. Just like to focus on the last one. It doesn't necessarily need to be the case that different countries use a standardized tool or data collection system, especially because if you standardize that, you risk to inhibit innovation and finding new ways to do things. What I am a supporter of personally is the use of free of open source softwares. QGIS is an example of a free and open source software. Not all open source software are free, but sometimes you need to pay a small a small fee to keep the project running, etc. But they're all open source, and open source means that you can contribute to their improvement and you can amend them to your own needs. So I think that would be a benefit. Going into the direction of open source software has the benefit of having them more widespread across the expert pool and the different departments. So you don't have one license of a particular software sitting in a single department, and you don't have any other license. Then you always need to overload that particular department with work. You could have it more widespread, and there you get to get the interaction between different data processing and different tools. Because if several people are able to manipulate, work on the data, create further refinement and information, you increase your data set, your collective database of information, and you can use that in different steps. So the output of your work, the output of your modeling, the output of your processing becomes the input of the workflow of a different department. And definitely would make sense to have some better solutions for data exchange, for exchange of data.
Yeah, I see Kevin makes the point that perhaps there's a regional initiative to procure and gather data that will be usable in Invest and QGIS. So perhaps that's a role for OECS in helping to achieve that, and to provide a sort of an experience sharing framework, so that, as Simone says, different tools can be tried in different circumstances, and you start to pool the experience and share the experience to see which ones work best under which, in which context.
Perhaps see, because there's a template that then that's flexible enough to manipulate from country to country in order to give that creativity and that contextual relevance that may be necessary. So maybe that's the kind of thing that in terms of collaboration for a regional approach, that might be necessary. But I wanted to go back quickly to John's comment about, because I don't, the St. Lucia situation where you had you said you had sectoral action plans in place. And I wondered about the potential of Invest to actually use those number of sectoral plans, action plans, to be the backbone for an integrated physical development plan. If Invest could be used in that way, I'm combining that information into one platform that could then guide integrated policy at a national level.
Correct. Yeah. One idea, Yolanda, I was just thinking as you said that, was not only could OECS, as an example, provide the guidance from a regional perspective, but from the St. Lucia, the way they set up their strategic sector action plans was to help support their national adaptation plan. So their NAP has a strong focus on mainstreaming climate resilience into all sectors. So the way that Invest, which wasn't used for their NAP, I do stress, but what for other countries on the call, if you are developing your national adaptation plan, I could see QGIS plus the Invest suite being really valuable to come up with the options from a climate resiliency perspective, not only for the national NAP, but also for individual sectors. So yeah, I agree, Yolanda. I think that is an interesting for the way that Invest could help support national delivery of spatial planning from a climate perspective, the NAP being one such possible output. We got a question from Pragati.
Hello, sir. My name is Pragati, and I'm a student in biology and environmental science. I just have one question. I like this software, and thing is, in Caribbean, there's a lot of volcanic activities and other, underground volcanoes and stuff. So my question is there any software that can recognize all these new island formation and primordial, pioneering colonies of islands, and can that be added to the data set? And also some kind of, it may be not a small significant island itself, but new colonies. So will that be like some kind of, ecological significance as some like mangroves or coral reefs? Because fishes also come to these islands and they might, in a few decades or so, form new colonies and islands. So I just want to know whether these data are actually significant in using in GIS software nowadays.
Simone, one for yourself there, I think. I know that to a degree, INVEST could be used if you use the bathymetry data set to sort of demonstrate new change. For example, if we just look at the bathymetry around Tonga after the recent sort of volcanic activity and tsunami there, there's massive immediate change in island formation and bathymetry close to where the submarine crater was. Whether INVEST is of the suite of models are the right ones for that, I'm not too sure. Do you have a view, Simone?
Well, you could definitely run the model with different land masses and different bathymetry input data. So after a volcanic event, or the appearance or changes in the bathymetric, in the relief, and changes most importantly in the landmass aspect, you could run the model again and see what compare the first run with the current situation or the previous situation and the situation under the results of the volcanic eruption, and compare differences, especially if new islands has appeared and that is reflected in your landmass input data set. You should see quite a lot of change, because obviously presence of landmass shelter in certain areas, it's particularly important. So yes, you could model that. You could model different changes. INVEST doesn't model what kind of changes in the bathymetry and the landmass you would see in case an eruption occurs. So, for example, there was no INVEST model that could have predicted the current situation in Tonga a year ago. There's no such a thing that I mean, at least not INVEST does that. There might be other models out there that do it to a certain degree with uncertainty, of course, but I'm not aware of any. What you could do though is you could have run INVEST in Tonga a year ago, and you could run it now and see what the difference is. That is something you can do. I'm not sure if that answers the questions. Thank you. Okay, monitoring the chat, there's been quite a few comments so far in terms of data and data viability, and we have seen a bit of we've seen in the last couple of days, we've seen where we have found the data, where you can find additional data, where our proxy for data are, and there is definitely an issue of data collection that is undeniable. There are some proxy out there. There is some free resources out there. I think that what few of the takeaways from this project for me in terms of data viability are that remote sensing is an excellent resource. You can do a lot using remote sensing technologies. Some of the remote sensing data set, especially Sentinel-2 data, are available for free. And you can do interesting things like land cover and land use map, create land cover land use map from those data. The other takeaway that I have from this probably is that supranational organizations like OECS or even international NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, the Island Coral Atlas, are in better position to collect data that are across different countries. So I think that when countries come together to collect and manage this data, they're more successful than when they're trying to collect from their own limited area alone. That is definitely something that I have noticed.
Simone, is your opinion of that that's because they can sort of maximize resources with some almost economies of scale type of approach, or is it something about working together generally?
There's probably an element of working together, putting together resources from different places. There is definitely an aspect of economy of scale. It's probably an aspect of the amount of data you can collect when you're more countries, and the type of refinement, the type of analysis you can do to improve the data you have when you have a lot of data. So I think that's an important drawback, at least, an important takeaway, at least for me.
Yeah.
There is some comments here, either a private partnership or major project funded via UN or Jeff. Okay. Right. Okay. Is there any other comment on these topics, Steve, if you want to?
No, I was wondering whether we anybody got any particular thoughts on the third of the third question that John asked people to consider about what additional capacity building might be needed. I suppose we've sort of started to touch on that a bit in terms of organisations such as OECS that may be able to find ways of assisting with that. But I wonder if anyone's got particular views about this capacity issue, and whether they feel that with some means of boosting capacity, this would be something that their country would wish to pursue further. Probably an unfair question, but
Leo here. I think that the opportunity for boosting capacity should never be overlooked or refused. I think one of the problems that we have is in Barbados is that it would need for us to be, as coastal, to be discussing with entities like the Lands and Surveys Department, who is responsible for all cartographic mapping for the island, etc., and GIS. So between them and the Town Planning Department, they have the most comprehensive GIS systems on island. And once again, we get into this situation where certain agencies and departments are very siloed in their approach to sharing of information and releasing of and accessing information, you know. But the agencies and entities that would have an interest in using this would have to be able to see the significance and benefit of it in order for them to then be willing to either share certain attributes and fields to the relevant agencies and departments that want to do this, or they themselves become involved down the road to see how it can benefit them in the longer term. So the need for capacity building through, first of all, increased awareness and enhancement of the resourcefulness of the software, I think is essential. Whether that's done on I don't want to say island by island basis, but those entities that or agencies and countries that express an interest, it may be necessary to take it to the next level where you have almost like a national sensitization of the power of invest. And it's a multiplicity of application to then carry that forward as a way to move. And then that would then encourage the potential rollout and use of GIS across greater platforms in governments that may not see the active use of it or the relevance of it as they do. So yeah, I would strongly support that.
That's interesting. Thank you. Kevin, I think you're going to contribute.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Just. Perhaps you could just speak up a little bit.
Is this any better?
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And kudos to Yui and to OpenPlan for hosting very informative workshop. One of the challenges that we face here in Antigua and Barbuda, and I don't think we're that dissimilar to some of the other territories in the OECS. It's the lack of the human resources. We just don't have the human resources required to actually procure first-hand data that could actually be used in Invest and QGIS as a whole. There has to be some program that is undertaken, whether it is a project funded by an external third agency or a project that comes through the OECS. A project would have to be undertaken that actually procures that data for us. That's one. And number two, all of the agencies that would be relevant to using Invest and QGIS. These agencies presently are understaffed and overworked. So even if the training were to be offered and the training is taken advantage of, in order to actually fill out what is required for Invest and for utilizing the QGIS models, I don't know if that would be prioritized, okay? Invest to me it offers a world of possibilities and options. And I do believe that it should be just like QGIS and ArcGIS. It should form part of the GIS system that these governments throughout the region utilize. But we're talking about priorities. Most of our islands, given the situation as now is with COVID-19 pandemic, etc., would it be prioritized? From a technician's point of view, it should be prioritized because it is a very powerful planning tool. So those are some of my concerns. I do believe we could stand to benefit tremendously from a region-wide initiative that looks at procuring first-hand data via maybe a PPP, public-private partnership, or from some major projects such as the GEF or the climate change initiative, something. But if we are to wait on the individual governments to see the necessity for this very powerful planning tool, I don't know if that's going to happen right now. Those are my comments. Thank you.
No, that's useful. Thank you, Karen. Anybody got any thoughts on how to progress that one? Yolanda, what do you think? Do you think we should? Do you think there's need for the benefits of this type of the use of this type of tool somehow to be promoted at sort of the top decision making level, so that so there's more commitment to it, and if so, is it even feasible to think about that?
From where I sit in terms of getting something on a political agenda to get buying in that kind of way, really, at the end of the day, it depends on how much, I would say, how much political capital is at stake. And if the stakeholders and the community and the people who actually drive the response of the decision makers and politicians, if they are not aware and they are not having seen the benefits, and I think it'd be a little bit challenging to just sell it as a tool at the highest level. I think you would really need to start from the bottom and go up. Yeah. And if you get the people involved and the stakeholders involved and recognizing the benefits in terms of planning for sustainable and resilient communities down the road, then over time, I can see it being something that the politicians and decision makers respond to, because it's something that people want. But that's just the perspective that I see it from.
No, I'd agree.
Think that
we need to move on. I don't know if in terms of time.
I just want to, before we can move on, I just want to quickly give my 2 cents on this last point that was raised. I think that the pressure, I absolutely agree with what has been said in terms of the fact that we can't wait for government to see the necessity of these tools and the necessity of these approaches. It's not necessarily the tool. The tool doesn't do magic. It's the way experts like you use a tool like this and have the necessary data to inform your decision. But it's difficult for the government to see the need for this decision, for this data, and the need for these tools. They don't see sometimes the back end. They don't see how this data has been used and modified, and it's been used, processed, and the information that you have derived from there, unless you make them evident to them. So there is definitely a responsibility from the expert to show the importance of this data, to show how this data can inform better decision making, and that better decision making is translated on the ground in development, in things that are important from a government in terms of job creation, environmental protection, reduction of risk, etc., etc. So I think it's for us as experts to familiarize ourselves with this model, familiarize ourselves with these tools, and showcase that those has been absolutely crucial part of our decision making. Because for some time, for a government, they've seen plan being done in the past without these tools, and they think like, okay, we can probably continue to do that, while instead we want to improve the way we do plans, we want to improve the way we plan and we manage with evidence-based solution. And I think that the other pressure needs to come from above, again, from supranational organizations like the OECS, but even the funding agencies, IDB, World Bank. They tend to request more and more a component of data collection, a component of use of tools, GIS tools, but also other quantitative models and tools into their program. And I think what they should also do is push for capacity building being incorporated in every consultancy and every project that interests different countries. I'm quite glad that UWI was very engaged with this training. They really wanted it to be delivered. We delivered it in 2 languages to be sure that we reached the highest audience possible, because capacity building was a big part of the project we were delivering. And I think that is definitely something that needs to expand and be more and more part of all different projects. Okay. Any other comment, any other consideration?
Just a final one for me, just saying that just to add to what you just said, and that high level of participation from a wide range of stakeholders is very important for supporting that capacity building at the technical level.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. Okay. In that case, I'd like to give, so I think we can move on to the last part of this presentation before conclusion, this training before conclusion, which is additional research. So a brief discussion on additional research opportunities. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Slideshow. Okay, so we are aware that there are a number of students among the participants today, or even PhD candidates. They could be master student, bachelor student, and even academicians among our group. So I'd just like to discuss a bit potential research opportunities that involve InVEST, coastal vulnerability model, or other InVEST tools, but even more generally coastal scenarios, and ask you what kind of application you see here, and even ask those that are not academicians and or students, what do you think the academia should provide to you as decision maker, as expert, that you can use in your work? So I always think that this link, this conversation between the academia and the decision maker must be kept alive. And I think this is a good opportunity to explore that. First of all, I just want to give a very brief selected list of literature that involves the use of InVEST coastal vulnerability model. I don't want to explore any of these in particular. All I want to do is to show you that there is quite an extensive literature on the use of InVEST, academic literature, published paper that uses InVEST in their own research. We have discussed that at the beginning. I think is a sign that the model is quite robust and is well considered in the academic world. I've also included a couple of dissertations just to showcase how the model, for those that are students, there are candidates, there are other PhD candidates or master and bachelor students. There is some dissertation out there that have used InVEST coastal vulnerability model in their own work, and I think that could be a useful starting point for your discussion. So I'd like to open the question to all of you and ask what type of research would you be interested in? What type of research do you think would be helpful to develop better coastal scenarios or to better use coastal scenarios in the decision-making process? So does anyone has any idea around any of these questions? Sorry, I'll go back to the. Any comment? Can you hear me all right? Just.
Yeah, I think Kevin.
You can hear.
Has
okay.
a comment.
Yeah.
Good afternoon again. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy that you have shown us these three questions, the type of research, etc., etc. A few months ago, in the latter part of 2021, our Ministry of Housing, Lands and Urban Renewal, of which the Development Control Authority and the Surveys and Mapping Division are a part of, we had contacted the University of the West Indies, Five Islands campus to develop along with them a training module, a training program that could be offered to the relevant technicians within the broad ministry. we had actually prepared, if you will, a very basic syllabus. UE 5 Island was supposed to have reviewed what we had proposed, and there was supposed to have been a meeting of the minds, and out of that would have come, if you will, a broader curriculum. Well, we haven't quite reached there, okay? But our ministry has always recognized the importance of QGIS, ArcGIS, and similar vein applications in the overall planning. One of the challenges here in Antigua and Barbuda is the fact that the government as a whole, the Crown, is the largest landowner on island. It has been since the 60s. So most developments that take place, not only on the coastline, but inland, as a matter of fact, the overall settlement patterns in Antigua have been greatly influenced by, if you will, Crown policies, and by a greater extent, policies directly from the cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda over the many years. It's a two-edged sword that we've had to deal with over the many years. Now, unfortunately, what it has meant is that there has been a very unusual conflict between what was the traditional land use, agriculture, and what has been, if you will, the future land use since the 60s, tourism developments and residential developments. And there's been this very high conflict that has essentially, agriculture has been losing these many years. Our politicians and our people are more interested in developing houses and hotels. All of that to say, it would be very useful to actually have training within Invest and broader QGIS application made available to the Ministry of Housing, Lands, Urban Renewal, Government of Antigua Barbuda, because this ministry essentially is the ministry that is responsible for most of the development that takes place on island. By extension, because the DCA is the authority that regulates and controls development, that means we have a very broad play in terms of how development is seen. So I am 100% for us putting the brains together and coming up with a proper training regimen that looks at Invest and QGIS, and also to procure the very necessary first-hand data that is very relevant and needed for Invest and for QGIS as a whole. Okay, none of this makes any sense without the proper data sets. And procuring data is a very difficult thing here in our islands, because from where I sit, I have a lot of priorities and I have to prioritize my priorities. I am answerable to my supervisor. He's answerable to the Honorable Minister. So priorities have to be borne in mind, okay? But suffice it to say that we at this ministry, we are very, very interested in how we could utilize Invest and QGIS as a whole. And I have typed that question a number of times in the overall group chat. How can we get in contact with OpenPlan and the necessary hosts to actually look about setting up possibly another set of training, or a broader project, something. We need to open discussion to move this thing forward. Okay, so thank you very much again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. That issue of how to move the training forward further is it is one that clearly we need to be discussing with any of the organisations who can sort of partner with UE to progress that. So, and in that context, I'm interested in the comment that Britta Hay has just made in the chat, where she says, I'm involved with the Caribbean Actuarial Association's planned actuaries climate index based on North American model, the same. And she sees potential applications there, but not quite sure what. So perhaps there's, I think, getting back to that suggestion of sort of PPPs, perhaps there's ways of harnessing resources from some of those areas to give a boost to at least the financial capacity to collect the data that's needed. So I think that's certainly an interesting one to pursue. You got any thoughts on that, Simone?
Yeah, it seems a really interesting association. I'll be honest, I wasn't aware of it. I'd like to explore it further, and there might be opportunities to include that type of data, the type of modeling in your work. I think this leads to something that one of the things that this consultancy led me to think, that is sometimes it's also important to know what is out there, and to know that there are other models out there. There are other ways of calculating certain things. There are other tools that can be used in your decision making, and that you start thinking about how to incorporate them in your own workflow. So there are benefits in that type of reasoning, that type of work. So in the chat comment, for example, we read, I see potential application, but I'm not sure yet what they would look like. And I think that starting to think about how you incorporate them in what you do, it's beneficial. It starts a conversation. We are happy to continue that conversation if necessary. And we'll definitely be in touch with this reality, and we could put together our brains, as Mr. Edwards put it, to look at different opportunities for work. This lead me, I'm gonna just move slightly ahead on my presentation just a second. I will explain what all of these are. I just want you to show you something real quick among the different key resources that I am going to provide you with. This is, for example, is an exercise that the IDB is conducting. It's called Code for Development, and it's a repository of different tools, models, and tools that you can use for a variety of different applications, mapping, informal settlement, that goes above and beyond coastal scenarios. The reason why I'm showing you this is, first of all, to let you know that there is all sorts of different models out there. And I'm not suggesting that each and every one of you learn how to use programming languages like R or Python or SQL, and that all of you become experts in all sorts of different models that are out there. But I think knowing that they are there, knowing a bit of what they could do, it's helpful for us as planners, as environmental manager, as different experts, to start those conversations that may be required to bring a tool like the one you're seeing on the screen right now into our own workflow, and building that that new way of doing things that makes you better use of available data out there. So that was just one of my consideration that arose from this project. Is there any student that wish to share their opinion on this tool? And if you have considering that you could use this model in your own dissertation if need be, or any other comment?
Adding to Simone's point, and also Mr. Edwards and Antigua, and it complements, I think, in the chat, Leo's comment from Barbados, is yes, being aware of all these different modeling suites of software that are out there. But one idea for making it work could be to target specific sectors, implying Mr. Edwards and Antigua saying maybe looking at agriculture is not such a bad idea. And this could help even with postgraduate focusing of seeing which of these techniques applies best for certain sectors, learning from that, disseminating that around the region, possibly getting OECS to support with guidance. But the success of this would be at the granular level, making sure each country is testing different types of modeling scenarios, aren't using specific models, and see whether we get some mainstreaming and some integrated approaches working best. And we look to our team in academia to help support that through good practice, testing, piloting, bringing that up to physical development departments, training, as Mr. Edwards was saying. How can we make use of that for national adaptation planning? So I think looking at sectors may not be such a bad idea, and learning from that, so we can sort of bring together parties and integrate it in a usable way. Any other comments from Simone's question?
Okay, so if there is any other comments, I'll just quickly show you the rest of this very brief presentation. There is not much else except I'm fulfilling one promise that I made you yesterday, which was the one of providing with the links to all the different key resources that I have been mentioning the last couple of days. So here you will find a series of links to some valuable either tools or blogs or website from where to download data that you can find and that I've been mentioning. So when we circulate the slides, which we will do, you will get those information as well. Okay, so I think that with that we have concluded these the different sessions of this training that we wanted to cover today. So I'll leave Steve to draw some conclusions on these 3 days of training, and then we can have a brief, obviously, if you have any comments, any questions. So Steve, please.
Okay, yes, thank you, Simone. And start with, thank you to all of you who've participated. And I know there've been more over the 3 days than are here now. And I hope that you all feel that you've got something worthwhile from the experience. Certainly the comments that we've received and that have been going through the chat suggest that a lot of you have found it interesting. I have been trying to get involved as much as I can. I've had to dip in and out a bit, but I've certainly found it interesting myself because I'm a spatial planner, So I've spent most of my life producing plans. One of the things that I'm conscious was very much missing from the toolkit that I was able to work with in earlier years was the sort of data and the sort of modelling in particular that tools like the models like Invest enable you to put into the planning process. So from my point of view, albeit somewhat late in the day, I'm really interested in the application of this and how it can generally improve the quality of planning, both from the point of view of plan making and also making decisions on particular development proposals as they come forward. So the first couple of days were focusing on really exploring and learning how to use Invest and QGIS for constructive modelling, how they can help to represent vulnerability and explore issues to do with exposure and risk. And then today we've been starting to look at ways in which the model can be used in developing effective policies and interventions. And I'm sure we could go further with that, but there's only so much you can do in a 3-day period. I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, that I think that comment that was made about plans having to tell a story and the quality addition to the story that is told that can be achieved through using tools like this is very important. And I think particularly in terms of convincing decision makers at one end and showing local communities at the other end in a reasonably easily accessible graphic format what these issues of exposure, vulnerability and risk are, can really enhance that storytelling aspect of the planning process. I think the discussion that we've just had about how to move this forward in terms of further research and particularly further exploration of opportunities to put the resources in to build capacity, both in terms of taking the training forward, but also capacity in terms of getting the data to the level that would ideally be needed to really make the best use of these tools. It is, I think that we've made a good start on that. We will consider that and obviously be reflecting views back to UE on that one, and certainly that's something we'd like to probably have discussions with some of you about as well as we go forward. I'll give John and Simone and Yolanda an opportunity to say something as well if they wish before we close. If I can just very quickly go to one slide, and I hope I'll get the right one. Yeah, just to remind us, I'll move this thing about, sorry, bear with me. I've had a very small part to play in the presentations, which I've enjoyed, but I'm very much aware that other people have put a lot more into it than I have. And I think the whole team I'd like to thank, but I particularly like to single out Simone, Canel and Luke, who've borne the brunt of the presentations and the training over the last 3 days, and I know have enjoyed the experience of working with you as the trainees. So thank you particularly to them, but thank you to the rest of the team as well. Anybody in the team want to say anything? Jonathan, you look poised, but perhaps that's just the way you...
Poised, but very simple. Great engagement through the 3 days. Excellent questions today. And I see an exciting set of opportunities. So I just want to thank everybody for being present and really being participatory, and some superb suggestions that we're looking forward to grabbing and putting in our final report. So thank you for your attention.
Excellent. And finally, of course, thank you to University of the West Indies, Mona, and the team there, and to the Inter-American Development Bank for providing the funding. But even more so, thank you, all of you, for your active participation in this very intensive 3-day period. Simone, say something at the end.
Yes, so I'd like to as well thank my team, UWI's, Mona, and in particular Dr. Stevenson and Erica Oughton, who help us throughout the consultancies, obviously, and in organizing this training as well. I'd like to thank the Climate Investment Fund and the IDB for this training and this opportunity. We will leave, I will put now in the chat the training evaluation form, and I invite everyone to please fill that in the next, right after we wrap up. Sorry, I'll email to everyone. There it is. Okay, so can you please confirm that if you click on the link, it will open in a different page, that you're able to fill that in. It's a very simple questionnaire. It's to be used for us. It's to be used for us to evaluate how this training went, but also to collect some of your feedback, some of your ideas. Especially, we discussed today that more training would be needed on this. So if it will be us who will deliver the training, your feedback would help us design an even more engaging and more compelling set of training. We will email this as well, so please fill it in now if you have the chance. Otherwise, we'll be emailing that as well. I will leave you with, I will put in the chat here my email address in case you have any further question on the tool, in case you want some further support in terms of running the models, or if you go through the recordings, which will be circulated together with the slides. So if you go through that and you have any additional question, any query, you can always email me. And or if you have any question for the other members of the team, please pass through me, email that to me, and I will put you in touch with either John or Steve or Yolanda or Miguel or the other members of our team. With that, I thank you all for attending these 3 days. There was a lot of information delivered, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.